Hello, everybody. Good evening. It's about time we started. Good. Thank you all for coming. I know that this evening happens to be quite a crowded one in terms of opportunities to hear about the Middle East in London, but the most exciting thing is that this is the best meeting and you're all here. The purpose and the style of Olive Tree Middle East forums is to explore behind the headlines and to try and come to a better understanding of exactly what's going on and what the implications are. And to help us do that in terms of developments in northern Iraq, northern Syria, just across the border from Turkey, and what that means for Turkey in particular, but also for the other players involved. It's extremely complicated. We have three specialists who are going to take 10 minutes or so each at the beginning to lay out part of the picture, and then we'll get into a discussion. And the idea is not for you to go back and forth with the speakers per se, but rather to see if we can collectively push forward our understanding of what's going on. So, I'm Rosemary Hollis. I'm Professor of Middle East Policy Studies here at City University and Director of the Olive Tree. And on my far right is Professor Bülent Gökay, who's come down to us from Kiel University. He's also had posts in London, amongst other places, and he is currently Professor of International Relations and head of the school at Kiel University, where he's based. And he is going to give us an outline of what the issues are for Turkey and why the Turks have been responding to the crisis in the way that they have. Then we come to a former colleague and friend of mine, Robert Lowe. We were both at Chatham House at the same time some years back, and now Robert is manager of the rather prestigious Centre for Middle East Centre at the London School of Economics, but he's also one of the few people, the only one I've heard of, that has done some research on the ground in northern Syria in terms of who are the Kurdish community there and their situation before this was, just before war consumed Syria. And now, of course, they've featured in the international news, that particular element of the regional Kurdish community. And then we're very privileged to have Professor Emeritus Sami Zubaida from Birkbeck College, London, who cannot be equaled in terms of his understanding of the social anthropological and cultural dynamics and communities across the whole region. And I'm not going to try and second guess what he will tell us. He probably will change his mind as the meeting proceeds, but in any case, it will help us get a perspective. So let's start with you, Ron, please.
Thank you. The world is rightly horrified by recent events in Syria and Iraq. ISIS's reactionary ideology and their barbaric violence caused panic and widespread outrage in the world. All this led us, United States President Obama, to initiate aerial bombings of ISIS targets in Iraq and Syria. In his statement announcing airstrikes, Barack Obama declared that, I quote, "We were joined in this action by our friends and partners, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Jordan, Bahrain, and Qatar. Turkey, the long-standing ally of the United States, and the only NATO member state in the region with 560-mile border with Syria, was not and still is not part of this anti-ISIS alliance." For some time, Obama administration has been pushing the Turkish leaders to provide full support to this campaign. It was Ahmet Davutoğlu, Turkey's foreign minister from 2009 until last month, and currently the prime minister, shaped Turkey's foreign policy in this current era, current period. And probably it is relevant to look at what Ahmet Davutoğlu tried to achieve in the Middle East, especially in relation to Syria. His policy popularly came to be known as zero problems with neighbors, has been the centerpiece of his so-called new foreign policy agenda. Accordingly, Ankara first developed close relations with Syrian regime to the level of a strategic partnership, also closer economic and political ties with Iran and with Russia. But then Turkey lost its way. The situation in Syria proved much more complicated and difficult for Ankara to handle. Soon Turkey's Syria policy has become an unmitigated disaster, and Davutoğlu's nicely drafted analysis turned into a mess. His so-called strategic debt turned into a great strategic failure. With Turkish authorities providing the so-called Syrian rebels an unchecked and poorly overseen support base in Turkey, Turkey has effectively become a side in the bloody civil war in Syria for the last 2 years. The Syrian crisis has exposed all weaknesses in Davutoğlu's claims of presenting Turkey as a significant regional power for peace and stability. The Turkish state now faces a Frankenstein's monster, as the growth of IS in Syria and Iraq is increasingly threatening Turkey's internal stability by bringing to the conflict, to the center of the conflict, the Kurdish population in Turkey as well. Currently, Turkey and the ISIS are engaged in a kind of Cold War. Both sides watch each other, but avoid any kind of direct engagement. There was a little-known Turkish exclave inside Syria, known as the Tomb of Süleyman Shah. Süleyman Shah was the grandfather of Osman Bey, the founder of the Ottoman Empire. This 2.47-acre sovereign Turkish land, located 15 miles inside Syria, has immense emotional value for most of the Turkish people. This shrine is guarded by a few dozen Turkish soldiers since the early years of the Republic. Around this shrine, two sides came face to face against each other. Since 2013, ISIS has encircled this exclave with thousands of heavily armed fighters and heavy guns, but so far refrained from any direct threat to the shrine itself. When ISIS conquered Mosul in the summer, in June this year, their fighters took 46 Turkish citizens hostage from the Turkish consulate building there. Turkish authorities carefully and very quietly negotiated for the release of their hostages. All through the summer and successfully in September, all of them were released. ISIS refrained from attacking that small Turkish exclave in Syria, probably because knowing that any such action could bring Turkey fully to the anti-ISIS front, led by the United States. Turkey has a large and powerful army and a number of bases near Syrian border, which could be used effectively to launch attacks against ISIS positions. However, the main reason to why Turkey is not so enthusiastic to join the anti-ISIS camp, in my opinion, is that there is little faith in the United States campaign. This is mainly based on the recent experience of the last 13 years in the Middle East. In particular, the bungled management of post-invasion Iraq does not inspire any confidence in the current US-led campaign against ISIS targets. There is a widespread belief in Turkey that the recent success of the ISIS and other extremist groups in the region is very much a product of American foreign policy failures in the Middle East. 2003 war in Iraq left a sectarian division, poverty, desperation, and an illegitimate government in Baghdad that did not represent millions of Sunnis and other groups in the country. Libya, again, is another example of the disastrous Western intervention in the region. The relationship of the American government to ISIS followed a familiar pattern, similar to its relations to Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. Both under George W. Bush and Obama administrations, the US government funneled money and arms to Syrian opposition groups as part of a general policy aimed at overthrowing the Assad regime. One significant result of this policy has been the growth of Sunni extremist groups such as ISIS. US diplomatic cables published by WikiLeaks revealed that the US State Department provided $6 million to Islamic groups in Syria between 2006 and 2010. In addition, a major gun running and military training operation was led by CIA to smuggle weapons into Syria from Libya, Croatia, and Sudan. A number of accounts of these operations were published recently in New York Times, The Guardian, Huffington Post, Daily Mail, Washington Post, and tens of other media outlets all over the world, including many major Turkish newspapers. Further military intervention in Syria and Iraq does rather play to the ISIS narrative that the Syrian and Iraqi regimes are the puppets of Western imperialism, and the only force resisting this outside intervention is ISIS. The only reasonable and practical course of action is to stop all military involvement completely and pursue a regional diplomatic solution while providing a much more significant and generous help for refugees driven from their homes as a result of the Syrian civil war. It was the wars and interventions of the last 13 years in the Middle East which broke up existing states, destroyed economic, social, and political infrastructures, and fostered extremism and sectarianism. This was the ground on which the ISIS did rise. Syria and Iraq do not need further bombing and military intervention, but are desperately in need of humanitarian help, in particular those millions of refugees living in camps in Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just to be clear, that's your recipe at the end, right?
Yes, of course.
Thank you. Robert.
Thank you very much, Rosie. Good evening, everyone. I'm going to focus on the Kurds in Syria in my short presentation. Developments across the southern Turkish border in Syria in the Kurdish areas have become increasingly important and influential and are posing something of a problem for Turkey currently. I will briefly discuss what's happening in Kobani at the moment, which has been dominating the news for the last couple of months, and also make a couple of points about the emergence of what has been called Rojava, which is Western Kurdistan within Syria, and then offer some thoughts on the relationship between the Kurds in Syria and Turkey, and indeed the Kurds in Turkey, and try and offer some light on what's a very complicated puzzle at the moment. So to begin with Kobani, which is so prominent currently, the siege of Kobani has become increasingly significant. Kobani is the Kurdish Stalingrad, is one quote I've recently read, or the castle of resistance for the 4 parts of Kurdistan is in Kobani. These are quotes from Kurdish leaders, and I think they indicate the level to which what's happening in Kobani is being elevated by the Kurdish national movement into something very symbolic and very important for them. The Kurds there in Kobani and in towns around about it have been fighting Islamist groups for some time. Fighting broke out first in 2012, so what we're seeing today is an increased continuation of that. But the siege, which has been ongoing now for, I think, 70 days in Kobani, is offering the Kurds a very potent brew of ingredients. There have been hundreds of thousands of Kurdish refugees fleeing the city at the start of the siege. Most of them are in Turkey. The Kurdish forces are relatively lightly armed, in opposition to the more heavily armed IS, who, until they reached Kobani, had previously been all-conquering. There have been many Kurdish martyrs, as they're described, including a number of women. The Turkish state has refused to help Indeed, rather dramatically, the Turkish state is sitting, the border of Kobani is right up against Turkey, and has been refusing to help, and has also been refusing to allow Kurds on the Turkish side of the border to help, and they've been standing there watching what's been going on within the city. Then there was a later development of Kurds from Iraq. The Peshmerga were finally allowed by the Turks to cross through their territory on a mercy mission to give much needed support and heavier weaponry to the Kurds within Kobani. And this is being treated as a celebration. It's pan-Kurdish fraternity, the Kurds of Iraq and Syria getting together to fight IS. And in the last few weeks, it seems the tide has been beginning to turn, and the Kurds are making gains within the city, slowly, but some gains. And there is now the prospect that Kobani could become a famous Kurdish victory. And that would be remarkable for the Kurdish movement in Syria. The Kurds in Syria have a much weaker history of mobilization and nationalism than Kurds in Turkey and Kurds in Iraq, and indeed the Kurds in Iran. They've lacked their own powerful symbols. There's been nothing like the Halabja chemical attacks in Kurdistan, Iraq. There was no precedent like the brief Mahabad Republic, which the Kurds set up in Iran in the 1940s. But the Kurds in Syria now have Kobani. Furthermore, many of the momentous events in the wider Kurdish nationalist movement have been failures, tragic failures. But Kobani could turn out to be a victory, and I think that is interesting. Kobani is also important because it was the first Kurdish town in Syria to be liberated by the PYD, which is the most powerful Kurdish party in Syria. In the summer of 2012, they took control of Kobani from the Syrian authorities. They then took control of other towns, and they've set these up as self-governing areas, which they call Western Kurdistan. Kobani itself is also a stronghold of the PYD, of that party. Other parts of Kurdish populated Syria are less supportive of the PYD, so that's also significant. I think what's happening in Kobani is also important for Kurds elsewhere, in Turkey, in Iraq, and perhaps in Iran too. And it's very rare that something which happens in Syria amongst the Kurdish population has an impact on Kurds elsewhere. Normally the flow has been in the other direction because of the relative size of the Kurdish movement within Syria. Rojava, this construct, this little polity which the PYD have built, have created in Syria, the vacuum of the civil war allowed this party, the PYD, to take control of 3 pockets of territory in the north of Syria. They're not contiguous. There are gaps in between each pocket. They are the Jazeera in the northeast, Kobani, and then further to the west, to the north of Aleppo, Afrin. By 2014, the PYD had built up its control of these areas, or partial in the case of the Jazeera, to style them as cantons, using Swiss terminology, under the collective name of Rojava, which means west. It's West Kurdistan, as opposed to North Kurdistan being part of Turkey, and South Kurdistan is part of northern Iraq. It's a rare experiment in local self-government by Kurds anywhere, and it's particularly remarkable it's happened in Syria, I think, because the very concept of some kind of autonomous entity for the Kurds in the country was very barely discussed before 2011 and the outbreak of the uprising. Let alone, it was not part of the party's demands. It just wasn't really mentioned in Syria before 2011, 2012. And I think the fact it's happened represents the very sharp opportunism of the PYD party and also its very strong organization. The PYD is closely linked to the PKK, which is a major movement in Turkey amongst the Kurds in Turkey. It grew out of the PKK, and the local government they've been setting up in Syria follows the political theories of the PKK's leader, Abdullah Öcalan, and the PKK party. They follow an idea called democratic confederalism. They argue that the nation-state capitalism have failed, and people need a direct system of bottom-up government. They believe in equality for women, for minorities, and the separation of religion and state. So they're offering a very different model to some of the other actors in the region at the time. They describe this as a third way, and it's clear that this progress is highly experimental. It's very interesting to watch it develop, and it's also very relevant for models of local government which might apply or be demanded by Kurds elsewhere, especially in Turkey, where the PKK is so strong. Indeed, it's interesting that the party in Syria, which is an offshoot, a sibling of the PKK, is attempting to implement Abdullah Öcalan's ideas before its big brother. I need to note that there are very deep divisions within the Kurdish movement in Syria. I won't go into it in detail here, but essentially it's the PYD on one side and everyone else on another. There may be as many as 15 other Kurdish political parties in Syria. The number fluctuates regularly, but they do not support the PKK. Historically, the PYD was weaker, and the older, more traditional Kurdish political parties have lost ground recently. They are now struggling to find legitimacy and support. Many of them side more closely with the Kurds in Iraq, with the KRG and Masoud Barzani as president of that. There's also a question for the PYD in Rojava about the way it operates, about the level of authoritarian control it's been implementing and asserting on the Kurdish areas. And there have been numerous accusations of harassment or violence by the PYD against other Kurdish parties in Western Kurdistan. And I think ultimately for the PYD, a question they have yet to address will be whether they are operating in the interests of Kurds in Syria or whether their goals are more defined by the interests of the PKK and the struggle the Kurds have within Turkey. So to move on to Turkey as the main subject of tonight's event, it is obviously massively influential in Syrian Kurdish politics. Geographically, map's gone, but all these Kurdish areas are right up against the Turkish border. And the bond between the Kurds in Syria and those across the border is extremely strong. Indeed, certainly the Kurds in Syria do not really view the border as relevant in terms of emotional attachment to fellow Kurds across on the other side within Turkey. They speak the same language, the same dialect of Kurdish as well. So the Kurds within Syria feel the struggle of the Kurds in Turkey as their own. It took me a while to understand the depth to which they feel this, but I suggest they feel anything that happens to the Kurds in Turkey as painfully as Kurds in Turkey do. They are very much one people. From Turkey's side, these developments have been very alarming, and I think they've struggled to know how to deal with them. The Turkish state appears to view what's happening with the Kurds in Syria purely through the lens of its long struggle against the PKK. It's been a 30-year war against the PKK in Turkey. And because the PYD is so close to that party, Turkey is utterly hostile to the gains the Kurds have made in Syria, and they're strongly opposed to this development of Rojava, of Western Kurdistan. Turkey also chooses not to distinguish between the PYD party and all those other parties in Kurdistan and Syria who are not linked to the PKK, which does not help the situation. For their part, the Kurds in Syria have accused Turkey of sponsoring attacks against them since at least 2012. And Turkey's call during the development of the uprising into civil war in Syria for a buffer zone just inside the Syrian border, which would largely be on Kurdish populated areas, generated real fears amongst Kurds in Syria that the Turkish military would cross the border. Today, Kurds frequently accuse Turkey of actively supporting IS, and the fact that the Turks have not allowed Kurds from Turkey to cross the border and fight in Kobani is very significant for the Kurds in Syria. A leading Turkish politician said recently, what's going on in Kobani is simply a war between two terrorist organizations, i.e. Islamic State and the PYD, the Kurdish party. This inflames the Kurds in Syria, and the result of this is that Turkey's position during the siege confirms the view amongst the Kurds in Syria that Turkey is a very serious enemy. Indeed, I don't think it would be an exaggeration to say that some on either side, i.e. the Turkish state and the Kurds in Syria, see each other as a more profound and a more dangerous threat than Islamic State. When Rosie invited me to speak, she asked me, is this a golden moment for the Kurds, or are they going to get stitched up again? I think we could argue both. It's certainly a golden moment currently for the PYD faction within the Kurdish movement in Syria, and the establishment of Rojava and the heroic defense of Kobani are their symbols of that. It's less of a golden moment for the Kurds in Syria who do not support the PYD, and at the moment can't do much about it. Whatever the outcome in Kobani, the future of this creation of Rojava is highly uncertain. It's in a deeply unstable environment, indeed a deeply hostile environment, and faces colossal challenges. In terms of being stitched up, the Kurds are certainly very short of friends. I think the Assad government would not remain passive if it were able to act against Rojava. I think it would pretty quickly snuff it out. The Islamists are obviously committed to its destruction, and the non-Islamist parts of the Syrian opposition largely retain Arab nationalism in some form and are fairly hostile to Kurdish autonomy in Syria. The Turks obviously are opposed to Rojava, and then the international community, I think, is pretty unsure what to do about it. Final few couple of thoughts. The only supporters Rojava really has are the PKK in Turkey and the KRG in Iraq, but I think both see Rojava largely within their framework, the framework of their own struggle, their own self-interest, and indeed the wider struggle between the PKK and the KRG or the KDP in Kurdistan, Iraq, for overall control of the whole Kurdish movement, for the soul of the pan-Kurdish movement, if you like. And we can see this struggle is being fought out to an extent amongst the Kurds in Syria. If the Kurds in Syria do get stitched up again, Turkey will certainly be playing a major role in that. What happens to the Kurds hugely depends, of course, on the course of the war in Syria. But for the Kurds themselves, the development of relations between the Turkish state and the PKK in Turkey is also absolutely critical. Either way, the establishment of Rojava and the accompanying cultural freedoms the Kurds now have and relative political freedoms mean that a return to Syrian Kurdish quiescence or inactivity in the face of many years of discrimination and repression is very unlikely. The title of this event is ultimately What's at Stake? Well, I think for the Kurds in Syria, there is a huge amount at stake at present. Indeed, the stakes couldn't be higher. To take one extreme of a possible outcome for them, which the PYD would like to see, there will be long-awaited cultural freedom, political freedom, and some form of democratic representative local Kurdish government. On the other side, it's possible to imagine a much darker, a much grimmer scenario where there is increasing loss of life and there's a much greater displacement of the Kurdish population of northern Syria. Whichever of these happen, or more likely somewhere in between, I think it's clear Turkey will play a major role in its outcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we move on, can I ask, Nitsan, can somebody get the map back up again? Ahmed, could you? See if you can retrieve the map. Thanks. I was going to say with pride, we've got Kobani on the map, and then you pointed out that the map had gone. However, the political geography gets more fascinating, and if required, and if there's an appetite, we can discuss some more what it is that, in terms of the regional competition for control of this area, what it is that has prevented Kurds from exercising self-determination or achieving the state that they had dangled in front of them as a possibility when the British and French were carving up the Middle East at the end of the First World War. And then it was taken away again, in part to do with the requirements of the big states that they now live in, Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria, that the idea that they could carve out their enclaves and form one big Kurdish state at the expense of all those countries has been considered a no-no in terms of regional stability. Now, what a lot of regional stability we have at the moment.
Right. The spectacular success of IS first in Syria and then much more spectacularly in Iraq. People have always talked about religion, about sectarianism and so on, all of which are of course important. But the most important element in this success has been the failure of the state. So first of all, it's the Syrian civil war and the withdrawal of the regime from much territory in Syria, which then harbored the various Islamist groups, the most important of which emerged as IS. But then what led to the much greater success of IS was in Iraq. And in Iraq, you see, in last June, the spectacular sweep of IS forces for much of northern Iraq, and in particular Mosul, which both strategically and symbolically is a very important city, very important territory. And through the taking Mosul, replenishing, or in fact multiplying their supply of sophisticated armaments, which they took from the Iraqi army, which fled from Mosul and the surrounding area. Billions of dollars worth of sophisticated American arms, of artillery and tanks and ammunition of all kinds, was taken and was instrumental, in fact crucial, in the further conquest and success of IS. Now, what happened? Why did the Iraqi army collapse in such a way? There were three divisions of the Iraqi army, and the officers were the first to don civilian clothes and run, and the others followed, and those who were slow were slaughtered by IS forces. And indeed, the spectacular success in Mosul was really the culmination of a process by which IS had taken over Mosul in a clandestine way, in a not such a public way, for the last several years, because the Iraqi government had been so thoroughly corrupt and weak and sectarian in that area that the various gangs, and most prominently the IS gangs, had taken over so many aspects of the Mosul economy and extracted huge revenue from a mafia-like extortion. That, you know, they were Turkish contractors working in Mosul who were paying $500,000 a month to ISIS as protection money. And that was true of many other enterprises and merchants and people with property who were being extorted, as well as various rackets of, you know, the word doesn't come to me. Very simple word. You take things across the border. What do you?
Smuggling.
Smuggling. Sorry. Smuggling rackets, in which the Kurds also participated, by the way. Now, the three divisions of the Iraqi army were apparently, by most reports, only 40% strength. So in fact, you know, for every 100 soldiers on the books, 60 of them were ghost soldiers. They weren't there at all. You know, this was in the First World War. The Ottoman army had so many absent soldiers who had fled that it had the category, which in Turkish was isim var, jisim yok. The name is there, but the body isn't, is missing. And that was the case with the Iraqi army in Mosul and many other places. And what was happening is that the officers who had bought their commission, you know, what happened was the central government in Iraq, and particularly the Prime Minister Maliki and all his cronies, were running this as a racket. So in fact, in order for a man to get into military college to become an officer, he had to pay, I don't know, $10,000 in order to be promoted into, had to pay for every promotion. So in fact, why are they paying all this money? It's an investment. So the fact, the object is, once you are an officer, then you can take a lot of the resources that are coming into the army. So instead of paying 100 soldiers, you only pay 40 and you pocket the rest. Instead of providing them with food and ammunition and clothes and what have you, you economize on that and you take the balance. And that was, of course, was happening not just in the army, but throughout, is still happening throughout the Iraqi state. And of course, added to that is the sectarianism and the tribalism. Now, so it's really the failure of the Iraqi state, the collapse of the Iraqi state, which was the tremendous factor in the success, in the spectacular success of IS. Why did the Iraqi state fail? Everyone seems to be mentioning the Sykes-Picot. Sykes-Picot is now a favorite in public discourse. Not only did ISIS itself talk about, abolishing the Sykes-Picot borders, President Erdogan also blaming all that's happening on the history of Western colonialism, Sykes-Picot. And of course, everyone, lots of people, commentators in the press and in public discourse in the West are also talking about Sykes-Picot. Well, that's interesting because, first of all, the Sykes-Picot divisions were never really implemented. The outcome of the First World War was quite different. Russia was no longer there. The Brits were ascendant. So in the Sykes-Picot agreement, Mosul was going to be in Syria. Lots of other things that never materialized. But the reason why everybody is going on about Sykes-Picot is the idea that somehow Iraq and Syria are artificial formations. They were cobbled together by two European civil servants who just drew the border lines, and of course there are all these great diversity of population, of ethnicity, of religion, and so on, which could never become a state. Well, of course, talking about the diversity and of being cobbled together, that is perfectly true, perfectly true. But then that was the case everywhere. After the First World War, I mean, if you look at the collapse of empires in Southern Europe, the Balkans, in the Middle East, in Africa, everywhere you had the formation of territorial states with very diverse populations. And of course, most of all, India. I mean, if you look at India, the diversity of the population in India, the number of languages, ethnicities, religions, and of course, India has had its share of troubles and conflicts and bloodshed, especially immediately after independence and the partition into India and Pakistan. But one way or another, India has lasted, has become in fact very successful as a nation state and as an economic entity, in spite of this great diversity of populations and languages and what have you. And that, of course, on a smaller scale, you see, as I said, in many parts, including South and Eastern Europe, after the collapse of the Habsburgs and the Ottomans. So why does it succeed in some places, even though you put the different populations together, and fail in others? You know, I mean, and this is, you know, the success of the state informing the nation. There were moments in the 20th century history of Iraq in which this was happening, in which there was a strong state, in which the state did act as a kind of protector and supporter of the population in terms of security, in terms of education, jobs, health, and aided from the 1970s by plentiful petrolic revenues and rents. So in fact, you know, under the early days of the Ba'ath regime was bloody and highly repressive, but at the same time it worked. It actually provided state services. It made the state and the associations, including the Ba'ath Party associated with the state, into a kind of survival resource for the population. And in a way which weakened the primordial unities of tribe and sect and what have you. It didn't eliminate it, but it weakened it. And what did sectarian mean? You know, sectarian, of course, sectarian was always there. But sectarian means lots of different things in different times and places. And so, you know, sectarian involved prejudice, Sunnis against Shias. It involved rivalry over resources, over jobs. It involved subordination to the state, although, of course, there were quite a lot of Shias even in the Sunni states of Saddam Hussein and his predecessors who achieved high positions in government and so on. So then sectarianism was there, but it meant something different from what it means now. Now sectarianism, especially with its reinforcement by the geopolitical conflicts in the Middle East, it means the denial of the other, wanting to kill the other. That, you know, not only does IS aspire to kill not just Christians and Yazidis, but most of all Shias, because, you know, Shias are the worst because they are supposed to be Muslims, but they are not Muslims according to them. But then on the other side too, you know, when you have some pretty fierce Shiite militias in Iraq, bolstered by Iran, and you know, this is something else we have to talk about at some point, is Iran. Asa'ib Ahl al-Haq, who are, you know, quite nasty. And so they've been also killing people on sectarian grounds, sectarian cleansing Sunni places. So in fact, this kind of sectarianism is not the sectarianism that we had in earlier years, in earlier centuries even. This is, you know, people keep saying ISIS is medieval. Well, it isn't medieval, it's very modern, because medieval times, these things never happened. You know, people for the most part lived apart or coexisted or what have you. This kind of violence and super violence, this kind of super violence that you see with ISIS, but also with the Shiite militias, is something very modern, nothing medieval about it. So I don't know, I mean, there's a great deal more one can say about this, but maybe I'll say it in
I think that's a wonderful idea. It's incredible to listen to you covering that span of people, places, and history, and we can explore further on a number of counts. But let's see who wants to explore what from amongst you. So, can we have 3 interventions, 3 questions or issues that you want to explore further? Oh. We have the magic of microphones coming to you, which is useful because we do record this on video and put it on the Olive Tree web pages of City University's website. Yes, there was a hand up just in front of where you are. Anybody else know they want to ask something, or they want to get into, yes, one here and one here. Okay. Go ahead.
My question will be to Mr. Robert Lowe. I was listening to you talking about golden opportunities missed on sides of the conflict. And I think one of the big opportunities was missed by Turkey, a golden opportunity to make peace with the Kurds, actually. After all the insurgency and after all the many issues they've had with the Kurds, I think this was the moment for Turkey, whether to intervene in Kobani in the very beginning of the conflict. If they had, they would have been, I think, acknowledged as heroes in the region because they were coming to save the Kurds. But Turkey's missed that golden opportunity, obviously, and I think it's a big chance they've missed. So I just wanted to ask you, do you still see a hope of peace between Turkey and Kurdish forces in the region? Regardless of whether there's a region carved out for Kurdistan or not, do you still see peace as an option after Turkey is rejected to help these thousands of people in pain?
Can Professor Gökay also respond to that in terms of, okay, Turkey missed what looked like a golden opportunity, but we need to know with a bit more emphasis, I think, what the spectre is for Turkey in terms of deals with the Kurds. And what is the future of the internal deal between the Turkish government and the Turkish Kurdish community? Right, there was no one here. Michael, can you put your hand up again, because she doesn't know where you are.
Right. Last month, as the military generals were meeting in the States to look at ways of handling ISIS, and Turkey had presented some of the generals. We are told that they agreed to be allies in curbing ISIS on two grounds: that a no-fly zone would be established, and that too. I forget the second one, but there were two conditions. Now, I'd like to ask whether these two conditions, in your opinions, were valid, or they were mere excuses by Turkey not to help.
Okay, and another one here.
Some of us think we have identified ISIS as a player in the war of the Saudi succession, which is in its preparatory stages. There are three questions I'd like to ask. First of all, thank you for putting the map back up, because it scares the living daylights out of me to see all the Kurdish flags head up beyond Lake Van, right up to the Armenian frontier. And I don't see any firewalls in place to stop any conflict which starts on the southern frontier. that's Murphy's Law. I don't see any fire breaks to stop a conflict which starts on the Syrian frontier, spreading all the way up to the frozen conflicts in Armenia and the Caucasus. The second thing that scares the hell out of me is the United States talking about shifting their airbase from Incirlik into Kurdistan, because that...
Which bit?
Pardon?
Which bit of Kurdistan do they want to shift it to?
The autonomous region in Iraq, I believe. That brings them awfully close to the Iranian frontier, who will go absolutely bananas. I'm looking again at the flags that I see. Isn't that Kurdish territory also where the GAP project, which is supposed to generate Turkey's hydroelectric power, located? So how does that? How can Turkey put its power supply in the control of somebody else? Perhaps okay. I'm totally off lead.
Okay. Well, when the two speakers to my right have dealt with the Turkish-Kurdish relationship and how to get Turkey on board to fight IS, perhaps you could address why it may or may not be appropriate to be scared stiff of a lot of Kurds along national borders.
For whom to be scared?
Exactly. He says he's scared stiff. Why would he be? Okay, you're going to launch in.
No, I mean, obviously, the KRG in the Iraqi Kurdistan, has gained marginally from the recent events and have taken control of Kirkuk, which is a very important city. I think the Turkish regime are very ambivalent about the Iraqi Kurds, because on the one hand, the KRG is in many ways a Turkish satellite, in terms of, especially in terms of its economy. There is a great deal of trade and of contracts and of sort of economic exchange between Iraqi Kurdistan to the advantage of both sides. So in fact, in some ways, the KRG is a Turkish protege, but at the same time, I get the feeling that Turks are uneasy about the fact that you have an autonomous Kurdish entity. The Kurds... Sorry?
And IS as part of a Saudi succession battle?
I don't know about Saudi succession battle. I think that the Saudis are, of course, our friends. The Saudis are the main, the main responsibility for the creation of all these jihadi groups. And in fact, if anything, if you look at the early history of the Saudi movement that culminated in the state, the Ikhwan movement, from the 18th century and then subsequently in the early 20th century, ISIS in many ways mirrors what they did at that time, but in a very different world. So there's, and also of course there is the geopolitical sectarianism, that ISIS is seen as a defender of and a promoter of Sunnism against Iraqi Shia and against Iran. So in many respects, I think a lot of people in the Saudi regime and the Saudi population are ambivalent about ISIS, not against it, definitely necessarily. And of course, it is Saudi and Gulfi money that created the jihadi enclaves in Syria and elsewhere and in Iraq.
Okay.
And now it became a monster. Sorry.
Well, let's come back to you in a moment
Yeah.
to see if you can tell us why it is generally understood that the Saudis, the UAE, and to a lesser extent Qatar are on the side of the Americans in combating IS. I must confess I don't know to what extent, and I don't know why they've come on board to the extent that they have either. Right. Do you want to tackle?
Yes, sure. Good luck. Why did the Turkish state miss its opportunity, a golden opportunity in Kobani? It would have been a very big step for them. I think it's perhaps a little unrealistic to expect the Turkish state to make such a huge move given the historical context and the complexities of this. I mean, in the 1990s, the PKK were operating from Syria with a lot of support from Syrian Kurds. Öcalan was in that territory, and it's not something the Turks have forgotten, and they greatly fear the opening of another front on their southern border. PKK currently operate from Kurdistan, Iraq, from Kandil, but if they were also able to operate from another border, that would be another front the Turks do not want to see. I think they greatly fear the instability that gains in Rojava they would see are creating, and they don't trust the PYD to run this entity in a sensible way. I wouldn't be too optimistic. No, I don't think the wider geopolitical conditions count against it severely. Turkey is very busy with dealing with these problems, and internally, Murat will talk more knowledgeably about this than I can. There have been on-off peace processes within Turkey with the Kurdish movement, and there have been some improvements. I mean, cultural, linguistic freedoms, well, I mean, not exactly freedoms yet, but there have been steps forward, but only in a limited way, and nothing yet too meaningful or deeply political. I think it will come in time, but Turkey's not quite there yet. And unfortunately, there's been a regression in the last few years. It was looking a bit more promising a few years ago. But it's taken steps back then, and now this massive insecurity, I fear, makes it less likely that Turkey will reach a proper peace deal with its Kurdish population. But separate to that, I mean, though these Kurdish issues are very interlinked, there are also different struggles. The Syrian Kurd struggle is with the Syrian state, really. And they've been fighting for rights from the Ba'athist regime since the 60s, since the 50s, pre-Ba'athist, but going way back. Their struggle is not practically with the Turkish state. And similarly, the Kurdish struggle in Turkey, I don't think they really care too much about the rights of Kurds in Syria vis-a-vis the Arab nationalist regime in Damascus. So I think we have to separate them to an extent, but Bülent will have more.
Yeah, Bülent, can you remember what the second condition was that the Turks had for entering the war against IS? And is it going anywhere, what the Turks are doing about IS?
Can I answer in a slightly different way, please? First of all, when we talk about Turkey dealing with Syria or Turkey losing opportunity with Syria, of course we are, for the sake of practicality, we are simplifying things. I mean, what is Turkey? I mean, is it like what we see is the policy of the whole Turkish population? Did they have a referendum and decided to do this or that way? So we are talking about a particular government or a regime, and regime's particular policy at a particular given time. And we know governments come and go, and every new government have a different interest and different policy, and the policy changes very quickly and very sometimes dramatically. So therefore, when we are dealing with Turkey loss opportunity, we're actually saying that the Turkish government currently lost an opportunity to find a practical solution to its internal Kurdish problem. Maybe this is what we are saying. But this so-called peace process, and I agree with you on that, that's why I said so-called peace process, is quite complicated, and there are so many layers on this peace process. When, in order to understand what is this peace process trying to achieve, or where it came from, where it is going, maybe one needs to look at the last 12 years very quickly. Last 12 years of Turkish history is very interesting, colorful, so many ups and downs, but also very different from the previous 70+ years, because this is the period AKP came to power, and from the beginning AKP had certain targets and certain challenges in front of it. And one main challenge from the very beginning, and I think that challenge is still there, even though weakened, the powerful control of the army and the secular leadership of the army controlling Turkish politics, something like an overwhelming umbrella on top of everything else. So from the very beginning, to expand the boundaries of the democratic process was for the benefit of the government in order to secure its power base against the secular like army and the other institutions which were kind of controlling and limiting the area where the government can maneuver. Kurdish peace process, so-called peace process, emerged in this context. And recently, it lost its momentum, as other speaker mentioned, simply because the government thinks it wasn't as essential anymore, because they consolidated their power base significantly after winning the elections one after another with increasing votes. It is even more spectacular than Margaret Thatcher's success in this country. Now, Tayyip Erdogan was voted with a powerful popular vote to be the president. So he feels much more powerful than before during this last 12 years. So in this sense, it is not really immediately important to the ruling party to secure the peace process right now, but to keep it in the agenda or to use it as a kind of a pawn in the struggle against various internal and outside targets or challenges will remain there. So in that sense, I don't think there will be any immediate or near future change in the situation in the region in relation to the Kurds. And also, I don't see this as a kind of a helping some people, desperate people in the region, because at the end of the day, what we are dealing here is a civil war in a neighboring country. So Syria is an independent country, a neighboring country, and there's a civil war going on, and this tragic episode is part of that civil war. So whatever we keep hearing from the media around us all over the world, all these horrific stories, but as the other speaker mentioned, these kind of horrific actions are happening in the region for the last 13 years. In Iraq, many groups, both Sunni and Shiite groups. In Lebanon, in Syria, the government, they have been using these techniques all the time. So therefore, maybe this sudden emphasis, concentration of ISIS's recent selected actions create this impression that there has to be something emergent and everyone should go and help those people. But at the end of the day, this is a civil war. So to intervene in a civil war in a different country is not as easy as we think.
I wonder if we can somehow juxtapose Sami Zubaida's idea that the sectarianism that's rife at the moment is deadly. It's about annihilating someone who is not you in sectarian labels, and that is new, that ISIS is extremely modern, with the idea that in the last 13 years, we've seen a pattern of behavior across Turkey, Syria, and Iraq, which come out of the relative weakness of governments. Is that what you're saying?
Relative weakness of the governments in Syria and Iraq, you mean?
Not Turkey.
Not Turkey, no.
No.
But as
definitely.
Turkey gets stronger,
Yes.
or the Turkish government leadership, because were you not saying that you replace a strong army-backed government with a new political party finding its feet, and as they had success and as they survived, then their behaviors change? But how does that fit with their behaviors have been there for 13 years?
Well, when they first came, the government used the human rights and minority rights agenda very successfully. And that's why when they first came to power, to be a member of European Union was #1 target of the government, and they took a number of steps. And this saved them, this secured them from any kind of direct intervention from the army. Because all those changes in the constitution, which eventually limiting the intervention by the army, they were presenting them saying that, look, these are the conditions we need to comply in order to be a member of the European Union. So they did this step by step, carefully, successfully, and quietly. But they think they now secured their base. I'm not completely sure about that, because Turkish army is still very powerful, as the institution is still there. And even though the top leadership of the army, the higher ranks change and all the pro-AKP generals are there, but the middle and younger officers are still completely unknown. So I think any kind of intervention in Turkish politics by the army is still possible. So for that reason, they need to be even more careful. If they took some quick steps in relation to solving the Kurdish problem, or intervening in Syrian civil war, or taking the army to northern Iraq, this may all have some completely unpredicted consequences. And they know this. And some people speak this and even imply this in certain meetings, those people who are close to the government.
Thank you. Where do we want to go next? One here, one in the top left, and one here. Ahmed, you could maybe come over this side. Damien in the front here wants one. Yes, please.
I apologise for arriving late, and to an extent that this topic was covered in the earlier statements. But what about the effect of this conflict on the Western nations? The UK government, mirrored by the American and presumably the French, have identified a terrorist threat from ISIS to be manifested potentially in the UK. And there's commentary suggesting that various attempts have already
Okay, we've got it. What's at stake for the UK and other Western states?
May I just add one more detail? The Western nations have been bombing rather randomly in Syria and Iraq, whereas the military advice is that to be effective, common sense indeed, to be effective, ground troops are needed. What is the panel's view on that, and should we actually get effectively involved?
Thanks. Damien?
That was partly what I was going to ask you. Just to go over that ground, it's fairly clear what's at stake for Syrian people and for Turkey and for Kurds and for IS, but just what is at stake for, say, Chinese people or Irish people or English people, you know. And also, if there is something vital at stake, when that's the case, the most powerful people in the world tend to make bets around the table on various sides. So who is placing their bets where in relation to how this plays out?
Thank you very much. Well, hang on the answer, because I know that there's several students here who know they've got to simulate what's going on Thursday in one of our master's classes here and play the roles of the different players. So if you can tell us what's at stake for all the powers of the world, that would be tremendously helpful. Yes, here, in the middle.
I have a question about the refugees and speakers. There was 25,000 refugees in the island of Lampedusa in Italy, and it was a crisis in Europe. And now there are almost 2 million refugees in Turkey, and maybe more in the Middle East. What do you think will be the future of all these refugees in the Middle East? Because I think it's a big issue.
Very good question. Why don't we have this one as well? Yeah.
Thank you. Actually, I was just wondering the rivalry between Kurdish groups in the region, how will it affect?
We can't hear. Yeah.
The rivalry between Kurdish groups in the region, how will it affect the situation actually?
How does the rivalry affect?
The rivalry between Kurdish groups.
Yeah,
in the region.
between Kurdish groups.
Yeah.
All right, let's go back to the stakes. Who wants to start?
What is the question?
The question is, what's at stake for the big players in the world who are outside the region? We've established fairly clearly that there's a lot at stake for the Kurds, wherever they live. There's a lot at stake for Turkey. There's a lot at stake for Syria, obviously, and for Iraq. What about the United States? What about the Gulf Arabs? What about Israel? What about Russia? What about Europe? Before we get on to refugees, that is.
Well,
Should we care, or should we just let it roll?
well, I mean, I think obviously it's there is the question of the kind of geopolitical interests of America and the West in terms of, you know, their client states, Iraq, what's happening with Iran, the oil-rich Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. I mean, all these figure there, but the way it is now, there is no clear cutting lines in this respect. You know, so in fact, you know, take the Syrian regime, for instance. What everyone was against the Syrian regime. Turkey and Saudi Arabia and all the sort of Sunni axis, their priority is to get rid of the Syrian regime, to hit Assad and his regime. Now, that is not at all clear now from the point of view of America and the West, because now if you remove Assad's regime, if you could remove it even, then the alternative is far worse. Not just in the sense of you get the jihadist groups, but also the fact that there will be a perpetual war between the different jihadist groups in the way that happened in Afghanistan. So in fact, you know, it is not at all clear-cut what, you know, in terms of their geopolitical interests, what America and the West should be doing in relation to Syria, and what they do in relation to the Kurds. Do they acquiesce in the breakup of Iraq? You know, I mean, the calculation of the consequences are quite ambiguous. You know, there's no clear line there. So everybody is against IS, yes, but then what about the other players? And what about Iran? I think Iran is absolutely crucial. You know, Iran has is the Iranians are the kingmakers in both Iraq and Syria, and they have the most influence in Syria and the Syrian regime. You know, I think, who was it? Someone at Chatham House the other day was quoting Lavrov, the Russian prime minister, saying to the Americans, you know, we have as much influence in Damascus as you have in Tel Aviv, and the real players in relation to the Syrian regime are the Iranians. So, you know, there's no way in which America and the West can really reach any solutions without bringing the Iranians in. So I think the question, and of course the other stakes for the West, is all their Muslim nationals who've become jihadists and who've gone to fight with IS, and what is the consequence of that when they come back? You know, as we see this in the news every day, what you're going to do about it. And none of this is clear cut. You know, I think you can state the problems, but you cannot really delineate clear positions and clear solutions.
Yeah, I must say that when you say this business of fear of volunteers going from the West and then coming back and nobody quite knowing what their attitude would be when they come back, it does seem that it's affecting legislation and security measures in Europe. The fears, whether substantiated or not, about the prospects. And was it not yesterday that there was some suggestion that there has to be a counter-radicalization policy in every British school?
And university.
And the university.
And university. And so you ask about the validity of bombing. Does anybody have an opinion on whether bombing some of the Nusra Front and a lot of ISIS positions in Iraq and Syria is productive? Yes, go for it.
Well, it was about 3 years ago. I was invited to a conference in Istanbul, organized by one think tank close to Turkey's foreign ministry. And the foreign minister, current prime minister, came to that conference, and at lunchtime asked me to go and sit at his table. So only me, him, and 2 of his advisors were there, and we were chatting, and he was asking me about Syria. And then I was, because he announced in the conference that the Turkey is going to host the Syrian or rebel groups conference, and then Turkey is going to help them to do this. And then he even said that Turkey was going to provide them military advice and support as well. So in that private talk, I asked him, do you really know who you are dealing with? And he said, yes, of course we know all those people. I met them several times. And I said, look, from the place where I live in England, I keep reading almost every day some really horrific incidents. Some of those rebel groups are doing, and there are lots of stories about the individuals involved in rebel groups, some of them coming from Chechnya, Afghanistan, and they are really, really dubious characters. There are so many characters, and you can't really be sure who you are dealing with. And he said, look, Professor, don't worry. We know what we are doing, and also I am telling you that in 3 months' time, Bashar Assad will be replaced by a pro-Western government. So this was 3 years ago. So I think that was the main mistake Turkey made. But of course, that mistake was created in Washington. So the Turkish foreign minister then was in coordination with Washington following this policy. So Rosemary asked, should we care or just let it roll? Of course we should care, but what we should care is what you ask about the human cost of the war, the more than 2 million refugees in the region, or maybe every single day increasing. This is probably one of the biggest human casualty of the last 10 years in the region, and we should care about this. But the solution is not intervention. The solution is not any kind of military intervention. So they need desperately proper financial help, support, and proper camps. Some of the places they are staying, or a large number of people just living on the street, because the camps, the tents, the houses, the surrounding governments, including Turkish government, provided them, are not enough for this number of people. So all this talk and all this effort going on, where should we intervene? Who should we bomb? I mean, just 1/10 of the money of those bombs already dropped there probably would have improved those people's life just immediately.
Robert, do you want to say anything about the refugees? Or indeed internal Kurdish?
While you've been talking, I've been trying to think of something clever to say about the Kurdish rivalries, and I haven't come up with anything. But seriously, one observation about Kurdish rivalry and how it affects, I assume you mean how it affects the struggle against Islamic State, is that it is relevant because the PKK and the PYD on one side and the KDP stroke Kurdistan Regional Government in Iraq on the other side have not been united. And there are problems, for example, on the border between Kurdistan, Iraq, and what is now Kurdish Syria, that there are incidents and there's a refusal to let the other side cross repeatedly. There are a lot of Kurdish refugees in Kurdistan, Iraq, who have been trained up by the Kurdistan government there to act as a Syrian Kurdish Peshmerga to come back and fight in Syria. But the PYD will not let them back in because they see them as a threat, as an opposing Kurdish force. So the development that Peshmerga fighters from Kurdistan, Iraq did travel to Kobani is very interesting, very relevant. And there were lots of accusations, not least from the Turks, that they were not welcome by the Kurds in Kobani. They didn't want them to come because they weren't of the right party, they weren't of the right faction. So, I mean, it's not critical, but it's an interesting element, it's an important element, certainly amongst the Kurdish groups battling against IS.
Right, more questions.
And may I just add that the Kurds in Iraq and elsewhere have had a history of factional fights and indeed hot wars between them not long ago.
May I offer
No, sorry, not right now. Let's get in people who haven't spoken yet.
I think we might have moved quite far away from the discussion, but there's one observation which I have. Is what I want you to understand is like how come in this area the ISIS, like the way we're like hearing this conversation that ISIS are kind of a gang or maybe an entity which is operating in this such a large part of the Syria, Iraq. What is keeping this organization intact? Because if you see the other organization in the other part of the world, like if you talk about Al-Qaeda, so they had 2 decades of proper training, then pure consolidation, and then between 95 to 2000, they had proper formation of a kind of organization and structure. Now we see this IS, which is actually almost kind of like at a similar area, creating a lot of money. What is keeping all these gangs or IS people intact? Because they could well be start fighting every second or maybe every month. But you keeping that organization feels like this. There might be some kind of structure in place.
Okay, thank you. Just here.
Just a quick question about refugees. Your point, it's absolutely, I totally agree with you, the importance of the issue and the things that we are focusing and the important things that most of the public, global public is missing.
No, it's when you're speaking into it, yeah.
Okay. But at the same time, refugees, they should be provided better facilities. But what refugees want is to go back to their home. So in the short run, exactly this should be the focus. But in the long run, focusing on providing facilities, which should continue, but it won't provide long-term solution for them to go back to their home. So what would be the answer? Intervention or no intervention?
Good question. There was just here Oh, and then the woman in the pink jumper afterwards.
This follows on from the first question.
Yes, can you speak right into the microphone?
Who has influence over ISIS, if anyone?
Who has influence over ISIS, if anyone? Right, and towards the front.
I just want to...
Can you speak right into the mic? Thanks.
You have already told that Obama had a critic towards Turkey, but do you think all those critiques and accusations are fair towards Turkey? Because the borders are not borders in the southern Turkey. I think they are not border anymore. ISIS, by the way, clearly threatening Turkey in each videos that we will come and bomb Turkey or Istanbul, something those. Anyway, they can take many barbaric actions in Turkey easily. So Turkey has to be cautious in a way, I think. Also, Barzani declared that Turkey and Turkish government is helping us, but secretly, because they are getting afraid of, Erdogan actually is worried about the elections, and they are also worried about by the ISIS attacks, but they are helping us. So what about these attacks on Turkey? Are they fair, do you think? I think.
Okay, I think to be fair, both Robert and Boulant have talked about in what ways it's serious and in what ways it's complicated for Turkey, even if their sympathies don't appear to be 100% with Ankara. But I'll let them explain that. Now, we've got here, is Turkey getting a bum rap here at this forum? We've also got, how is it that Islamic State is enduring the way it is when Al-Qaeda didn't? And who has influence with IS? And just to round it off, because we won't have time for any more, I think, Sami, if you could address the subject of refugees and refugees wanting to go home. Because you've been able to make so many comparisons in terms of state formation out of imperial domains across the landscape, can you also help us with migrations and war? Is it not the case that there are massive movements of people, and have been throughout the 20th and 21st century, especially triggered by wars like the First and Second World Wars? And that therefore we should see the refugee crisis not from Syria, and to some extent from Iraq, not just in terms of the last 10 years, but in a larger context and the implications of that. Right. Defend Turkey, please.
Well, I'm not here to defend Turkey or Turkish government, but in my presentation, I didn't criticize the current cautious approach, just the opposite. What I criticize, Ahmet Davutoğlu's change policy after the first peaceful relationship with the neighbors and the diplomacy and the economic relations, I think that was the right thing. And then when they followed the American lead and started to intervene unofficially internal affairs of Syria, that was the mistake. So at the moment, of course, they shouldn't intervene. I think also we are discussing this situation, this disaster situation, thanks to the last 13 years of military interventions. So why do we need some more military interventions to make the situation even more miserable, more disastrous? So how can we make the conditions better for those refugees to go back home? Not by bombing, not by intervening or militarily. We will create millions more if we continue these military campaigns. I think the military bombing and intervention or any idea intervention should stop.
Nobody was bombing from the outside at the beginning of the Syrian civil war, were they? The refugees were fleeing Syrian government force bombardments. So what is one supposed to do about that?
Well, the solution, I think I mentioned briefly, is there has to be a diplomatic solution. I think all the regional powers first, plus the global powers, they have to put all their efforts to bring all the parties to negotiation table. And especially Iran and Russia are important. If you take them on board, and then you put pressure on the regional powers, and then try to find a diplomatic solution. At the meantime, provide all help to the refugees or all kind of economic and political help. But military intervention is completely, I think, a wrong thing to do. It is like throwing oil to the fire.
Okay, thanks. Robert?
Just one observation, which is that I find it very interesting, given the depth and complexity of Turkey's relationship with Syria and what was there before Syria, that its policy was so wrong and it made such a mistake, such a misjudgment. I find it remarkable, given the historical connection in Syria.
Yeah, but which moment?
Oh, from the very beginning. I mean,
of the Syrian
war, how Turkey consistently got it wrong and has got it wrong. It surprises me because I perhaps naively had assumed they had a better understanding and would have had a better judgment of how things might proceed, but it perhaps simply illustrates how messy, how complicated, how difficult Syria has become.
And actually, to be fair, they're not alone, are they? Because the Americans were pronouncing the end of the Assad regime very quickly. Sami, can you do some general comments on IS, how it's consolidating, who could talk to it, and what about refugees?
Well, IS, when it was the Islamic government of Iraq, right back from, to the American invasion of 2003, soon after that it formed. So it has deep roots in Iraq and in organization, which was defeated in 2007 by the American plan to arm the tribesmen against the Qaeda people. And then that was undone subsequently by Maliki and his policies, in which, these the awakening people, as they were called in 2007, who were supplied by the Americans and paid and so on, then were persecuted and dissolved by the Maliki government in 2010. So in fact, there was no longer a barrier to the Islamic State people. And then, of course, they got their great stimulus from the war in Syria, the civil war in Syria. And what the basis of their great success now is that they've taken territory. They've actually taken territory which includes resources. They've got, not only did they capture all these armaments from the Iraqi army, but they've also captured oil wells and refineries and agricultural resources, and they are engaged in large-scale smuggling across frontiers, especially of oil, and the Turks are still buying from them. I don't know which Turks are buying from them, but they are, and that is one possible influence that people could have over IS is to try and stop this trade. And they've also taken a great deal of money from the banks when they invaded Mosul. So in fact, they've got billions of dollars in their coffers, both from what the rackets that they were running, from the oil, and from the banks that they had robbed. So that, and of course they're also very good at administering all this. Somebody said they're jihadists with MBAs. They actually have quite a good technical knowledge, and they use their manpower wisely, and they actually pay their volunteers $200, $400 a month. So in fact, in all these respects, they are they've got much better position than Al-Qaeda had in Afghanistan. They've got far more resources, much better organization, and regular supply of volunteers. Then, sorry, what, refugees?
Yes.
Well,
are we witnessing something new, big, in the scheme of things?
It's not new, but it's big. I think what the difference between now and the First World War, for instance, is that there were far fewer people then. And I think this is very important, is that the enormous population increase in the the decades since the middle of the 20th century is very important in determining what's happening now. These millions that are in Lebanon and in Jordan, as well as in Turkey, at least in Turkey, they are a small part compared to the huge Turkish population. But in Lebanon and Jordan, in Lebanon, they are nearly a quarter of the Lebanese population. So quite apart from the human cost of being refugees, there's also the political problem of the destabilization of these countries. What you do about it, I mean, I don't know. And they're not the result, as I think Bülent had said, they're not the result of no, sorry, Robert said it, of bombing. They were, the part of the refugee exit from Syria was the Assad regime, and then the IS and the enormous flow of both Syrian Arab and Kurdish and Yazidi and Christian refugees into Turkey and into the KRG part of Iraq and into Jordan and into Lebanon. So, what you do about that, I really don't know. I mean, it's an enormous problem for the countries concerned and for the people who are suffering as refugees.
I think we've established this evening that the problem is bigger than usual, and that the can-do attitude of the United States will not be enough in this case, and that we are all going to have to keep watching and assessing, because we cannot predict where these multiple forces and countervailing forces are going to take us in the Middle East. But I thank you all for coming and concentrating so hard, and thanks ever so much to the panel for saying so much that was elucidating.